Welcome to Eternal Christendom, consecrated to Our Lady for the glory of our Lord. I'm Joshua Charles. Just finished a wonderful interview with somebody I've admired for a number of years. He goes by the name Classical Theist. He is an internet personality who has retained his anonymity to avoid some of the craziness in this world, but absolutely wonderful man. And so wanted to give you guys a little bit of his biography so you know what you're about to get into. Classical Theist was raised Catholic, but with poor catechesis. That never happens among Catholics, right? As a result of this poor catechesis, he became atheist in his teenage years and devoted much time to refuting theistic arguments for the existence of God. And as you'll hear, he was actually very much drawn into atheism by the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, etc. However, he discovered the scholastic intellectual tradition later in high school, the scholastic tradition being refined and synthesized during the medieval period, St. Thomas Aquinas preeminently, of bringing philosophy, the Fathers, Scripture all together into one coherent system. And so as a result of coming into contact with the scholastic intellectual tradition, he reverted to his Catholic faith from atheism in 2014. And he ended up starting a YouTube channel that did online apologetics in 2017. And so we're in 2025, so we're about 8 years now for Classical Theist and all of his work. So his apologetics work has been devoted to a number of things. First, refuting atheism and atheistic systems of thought. Also using metaphysics and philosophy to establish rational foundations for the Catholic faith. Also popularizing the Catholic intellectual tradition against secular philosophies and frameworks. He also addresses concerns about the problem of magisterial discontinuity in the Catholic Church, meaning apparent discontinuity in what the Church actually teaches. And finally, providing theological support and justification for conservative politics and traditional social perspectives. So Classical Theist is a very learned, articulate man. And one thing I really love about him as well is that he conducts himself in the online space as a gentleman, frankly. He can be direct. Gentlemen can be direct. They can kind of hit it right between the eyes sometimes, but they are also polite. They are not. They don't engage in ad hominem. They don't insult people gratuitously. They just share the truth and let the chips fall where they may. Classical Theist is also married. He has a wife and a son. And I think you'll really enjoy the interview. We actually were planning to get to a number of topics, including the papacy and a bit more about online culture, Gen Z, millennial type stuff. We got a little bit to the Gen Z, millennial, online culture bit, but we were not able to get to the papacy at all because the things we were talking about, at least I thought, were just too interesting. So we will definitely do a follow-up interview with him about the papacy and addressing questions about that, particularly in light of the current pontificate, in a future episode. So with that, here is the interview with Classical Theist. All right, so welcome to our interview of Classical Theist. I've read his bio, very excited for this interview, and welcome aboard, Classical Theist.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. It really is great to be with you. I've just been a long time admirer of the work that you've been putting out lately, and just honestly, like you've been very prolific, I would say,
Yeah.
over the last couple of years, and I think it's just been really impressive. I try to read most of your posts and try to catch up on your YouTube content, and I'm just I'm honored to be with you.
Well, thank you. I saw you a few years ago, and you retain your anonymity, but we reached out to one another and have become acquaintances. And I was just consistently impressed with how substantive your approach to everything was. I was like, man, this guy is impressive. He knows his stuff. And we are both common admirers of the angelic doctor, St. Thomas Aquinas. So before we get too far into it, let's just open with quick prayer. And your patron saint is St. Thomas Aquinas, mine is St. Ignatius of Antioch, and then we'll ask them to pray for us as well as our guardian angels. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Ignatius of Antioch, guardian angels, please protect and guide us, and guide all the audience members who are going to listen to this interview, and bring to their thoughts the knowledge that you would like them to receive from this interview, and so that they can grow in faith, hope, and love. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Well, like I said, I saw you a few years ago, and I was consistently impressed with how deep and substantive you are. And you're kind of like right at the right at the dividing line between millennial and Gen Z. And so I think you also have a wonderful insight into the nature of internet culture, and which we'll talk about as well. So we'll cover your reversion. We'll cover internet culture, Gen Z stuff, because I think one of the things you do so well is you stay calm and collected. That's something I try to do as well. You know, we're both very direct because that's just sometimes required. But, you know, I don't know about you, but I always am reminded of our Lord's words that, you know, he warns us that you will have to account for every word. And so I think about that before every post. And I think it, you know, keeping that at the forefront of our mind helps elevate the content that we're putting out. So that, and then finally we'll cover the papacy, a proper understanding of the papacy. Obviously, that's a huge topic, but you know, during this pontificate with Pope Francis, there have been a number of questions, and so you know, I'm just going to play devil's advocate with you from a Protestant and Eastern Orthodox position in light of the present pontificate, especially because I think you have a lot of wonderful insights on that as well. So that sounds like a good game plan.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited.
Great. Okay. Well, I mean, the first part is just your reversion, you know, so I'll let you just start wherever you want. And as I told you beforehand, and I'll tell the audience, you know, because Classical Theist retains his anonymity, there's no facial cues to go off of. So I will do my best to not interrupt, but I know we're also in a discussion as well. So if I interrupt, you know, just push back and I'll you know, hold off. But I'll do the best I can without facial cues.
And you know, honestly, those are welcome anyway. I like when the conversation is give and take and everything.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, you know, it's very similar as far as like the origins of it. Very similar to, I think, a lot of people. I was raised Catholic, baptized, went through a pretty standard catechetical upbringing, and I think that's part of why it was unsuccessful.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah. So just I was just kind of exposed to just very poor catechesis growing up. Not to any fault really of my parents or anything, but it was really the parochial system, the parish way of doing catechesis. It just didn't really expose me to any kind of depth of, you know, the Catholic intellectual tradition. I mean, and that's partly on purpose, right? Right. There was this kind of sense that you don't want to overwhelm them with the depth of the tradition. You want to start with this dumbed down initiation, and then gradually you would get to deeper stuff. But
Sure.
I never really got to the deeper stuff, and
Yeah.
so given that just shallow nature of that catechesis, that combined with the fact that I had always been very interested in philosophy, getting at the root of questions. Um, Honestly, but part of it was kind of to a fault almost. I'm kind of the type of person where if I don't sense that holes in my worldview are resolved, and resolved in a way that I can't really ask further questions about it on some level, I just can't sleep at night. Like it just won't. I won't. My mind will be constantly occupied with trying to resolve those those intellectual consistencies in my mind. And so
Sure.
that made me fall prey pretty easily, I would say, growing up in my teenage years to, you know, the new atheist critiques, which
Oh, yeah.
were at that time, this was about, you know, well over 10 years, like 15 years ago, riding pretty high. I mean, I would say it kind of reached its apex in the like 2007, 2008, 2009, but it had a really a decent longevity well into the mid 2010s.
And
It's
just so
kind of
people
died down a little
know,
bit.
there may be some in the audience who don't know who the new atheists are. So would you mind just telling them who
Yeah,
those are?
yeah. So you have like the four horsemen, they call it:
Yeah.
Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. But then you have a whole you have a whole bunch of other atheist figureheads that are just part of that general movement. They ended up calling themselves ridiculous names like the Brights and, you know, skeptics. That just that whole kind of revival of atheistic and skeptical thought that really took off after 9/11 in
Yeah.
a big way. 9/11 provided an opportunity, and the ensuing Iraq War and things like that
Oh, yeah.
provided a pretty clear pathway culturally for critiques of religion in general to enter into the forefront of public discourse. So, and that of course combined with the information age, the internet, the social media in its infancy. I think that provided, that really gave a lot of steam to that movement, a lot of cultural steam to that movement, and so I fell prey to that pretty easily.
Well, if I could
Didn't
pause
take,
you really quick, just for
yeah,
younger members
absolutely.
of the audience, who may have still been in elementary school or younger when you were experiencing this, because I remember this well. It was in late high school and early college for me. And you mentioned the Iraq War. People who, may not be familiar, but during the Iraq War, there was a huge insurgency in Iraq where basically the different rival sects of Islam within Iraq,
Yep.
the Shia, the Sunni, there were probably some others I'm not super familiar with, but they were duking it out and blowing each other up, suicide bombs,
Right.
IEDs.
That's where you get that classic phrase of like, religion will cause planes to enter into, or to crash into skyscrapers, whereas
Yeah,
science will take us to the stars. That those kinds of sentiments, I think,
yeah,
um, really resonated with
yeah,
a lot of people who, and part of it was because over the last number of decades, the church had simultaneously dumbed down its presentation of the faith, and
yeah.
so it was kind of a perfect storm, I think, for
And it was on our
this.
TV every day. That's why, I
Yeah,
mean, the Iraq
exactly.
War lasted for, I don't know, 10 years or so. And
Right.
so almost every day, we're seeing images or hearing reports of new explosions in Iraq, 100 civilians killed here, 200 civilians killed there, U.S. soldiers killed. And of course, for me, I was in eighth grade when 9/11 happened. And it was really kind of a BC AD moment in my life.
Yeah.
It's just everybody know. It was like our generation's, I don't know how old you were at the time, definitely younger than me, but it was like our generation's JFK assassination. I mean, everybody remembers exactly where they were. And it's kind of shocking to me in 2025. I've got numerous friends who either weren't alive at 9/11 or were like little babies. So it's just kind of strange to me. But it was horrifying. I would, this would be a bigger topic, but maybe we talk about it a bit, because I know that one of your concerns is political philosophy, mine as well. But it really, I think 9/11 really initiated kind of this exposure of and downfall of the American empire. Not to get too sidetracked, we're still in the New Atheist, but maybe we talk about that a little later, because that 9/11, the Iraq War, how Afghanistan turned out, it played a huge role in the New Atheist stuff, but it's also played a huge role where I think we are politically as well. So,
Well, yeah, and you also had the fact that, um, I would say the main cultural presentation of Christianity was pretty thoroughly fideistic.
and what do you mean by
With the
that for the
exception of
audience
some,
member that doesn't know?
yeah, it was, I think its main cultural presentation was pretty evangelical Protestant,
Yeah,
um, and that just didn't carry with it the kind of intellectual weight that could rival that of a Richard Dawkins or
yeah.
that of a Christopher Hitchens. In reality, of course, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, the intellectual depth is not much to
Oh,
speak
it's
of.
shallow.
And,
Yeah,
and I came to realize that
yeah,
as I had begun um, thinking through their philosophies over time, but just but for someone who has very little formation in any of that stuff, very easy to fall prey to it. So I did, and
Well, and just so
and I got
people
pretty,
know, sorry,
yeah,
because you use a term, I want to make sure the audience knows fideistic. And, you tell me if you think this is right. This is my understanding of something
yeah,
that's fideistic. It's kind of treating faith as purely blind, that it doesn't need any rational basis. It's like, not that, it's like, because obviously articles of faith they transcend rationality, but the church has always taught that faith and reason are partners. They come from the same
yeah,
source and they ultimately lead to the same source, God. But fideism is like, no, faith is completely blind. It's not connected with the intellect, really. It's just purely blind. There's no rational arguments we can offer, sort of a superstructure for it.
I think that kind of stems from just a mistrust of the human faculty.
Okay.
That, we're kind of just so depraved as to be unable to provide any kind of natural foundation for the supernatural truths. That's kind of, I would say, the theological origin of it. But over time, it sort of trickled down into this general sentiment of just an unwillingness to provide a deep intellectual foundation to the faith. I mean, you have exceptions to that. Like you had people like William Lane Craig.
Yep.
But he has his own issues, and I might get to that in a moment.
Yeah.
But anyway.
One more comment. Sorry, one more comment, because you mentioned evangelical. This was very connected with evangelicalism. There were some smart evangelicals, William Lane Craig, J.P. Moreland, Nancy Pearcey. These were all formative people in my life as a Protestant. But there was an evangelical historian, I believe it was Mark Knoll with a K, because English is what it is. But he wrote a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. I think and he's an evangelical. And I think the opening line of that book was something like, the scandal of the evangelical mind is that there is no evangelical mind. Something to that effect. So this is not just Catholics, complaining about evangelicalism. It's something that, quite a few evangelicals of a higher caliber have recognized themselves. Right. So
I think part of it is because, and I guess I'll just mention very briefly my problem with William Lane Craig, just because it also shows, when I was getting into atheism, I did have exposure to those people. And that's when I really started to try to sharpen my arguments against theism and against Christianity. And I found it easy to do, actually, when I was just exposed to these people. And I think the reason is because they, in order to provide an intellectual foundation for Christianity, they just borrow from secular philosophy or secular experimental science in order to do that. When in reality, they are borrowing from frameworks that I think are theologically neutral in and of themselves. So it really doesn't mix all that well with Christian claims.
What would be an example?
A great example of this, I think, is William Lane Craig, who will try to advance his argument for a first cause by appealing to all of this Big Bang cosmology. And the problem is that kind of an argument, it can't really answer some fundamental objections. Like it might get you to a first cause, but it's not really capable of telling us anything meaningful about who God is, why theism is not just necessary as like an additional hypothesis, but is a precondition for the possibility of anything, of anything existing. In other words, it provides no solid metaphysical framework that Christianity can comfortably sit within. And so, so when I'm exposed to these kinds of arguments, it's kind of easy for me to just say, okay, even if I accept it, it doesn't lead to the conclusions you think it leads to. So yeah, it just was very unconvincing to me.
Let me see if I understand this, because this is an interesting point. I've not, it makes sense, but I haven't heard it articulated that way. It's been a long time since I've engaged with William Lane Craig and whatnot. And I like him personally in many ways.
Sure.
But he's got some major issues. He's done a wonderful job on some things, but less on other things. Although Sam Harris, to give credit where credit's due, I do recall Sam Harris joking one time that William Lane Craig was the Christian apologist who could put the fear of God in atheists. So, because I do think he had some pretty stellar debate performances with some of them. Yeah.
He was smarter than all of them.
Oh, yeah.
I'll give him that much.
Yeah. But when you're talking about, relying on the Big Bang cosmology, let me make sure I'm understanding correctly. You wouldn't object, I would think, to, in addition to metaphysical arguments, including some of the latest scientific evidence for something like the Big Bang, where time and space came into existence, it themselves came into existence at a particular point. Would that be correct? You don't object to supplementing the metaphysical with those types of arguments. It sounds like you're objecting to William Lane Craig relying on that argument as a sort of physical argument without, divorced from metaphysics. And then, I know that, Dawkins, Hitchens, all these guys, it'd almost be like they'd say, well, if we don't understand it, because everything was confined to the physical, if we don't understand it now, we will understand it at some point. And that was always their basis for continuing to remain atheists. It's like, well, if we don't understand it now, we'll understand it later, which is what you can do if it's confined purely to a physical argument. So is that kind of what you're saying with this?
For the most part, although I generally do just caution against spending too much time with that, just in general. I think it's useful apologetically. I mean, I think it's kind of a shortcut, if you will, to getting people's, blowing people's minds, getting them to think, wow, I never thought of that. And, but I think that's kind of an easy way out on some level. And I think sometimes if you aren't couching even your scientific terminology within a proper metaphysical framework of things, then you can lead to problematic conclusions about what you mean by God himself. Even while you're advancing the argument that you're advancing. So I think if you're quite right, I'm not opposed to, I guess, finding within the findings of experimental science certain avenues for critiques against materialism, things of that nature. I mean, I'm not opposed to that in itself. But I think that if you're going to do that, you had better educate yourself about the metaphysical foundations first, so that you can speak about that more intelligibly. So that you can speak about those things in a way that has more coherence with the foundations of Christianity.
Well, and this would be a good point. Can you tell the audience what metaphysics is and why this is so important?
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to contextualize this whole conversation, actually. So, of course, Aristotle, there's this general definition of metaphysics as the study of being as being. So, when we consider metaphysics in that sense, it's considering not this being, not that being, not this way of being, not this manner of being, and certainly not this physical system versus that physical system. It's really getting at what commonly brings all of those things together for universal consideration, which is being insofar as a thing simply is. And subjecting that to rational consideration, subjecting that to logical analysis, to intellectual analysis. And that is necessary before we can get into other topics, because whenever we speak about anything, we carry with it a whole number of different presuppositions. And those presuppositions are always going to be traced back to, what do we mean by being in general? What do we mean by being itself? Right. And that is why, that's why metaphysics, most people who get into metaphysics, who consider metaphysics, who study it, end up finding God understood in a more robust sense at the end of that investigation. Because you come to realize that there has to be some irreducible principle of being, this irreducible unity of being that precedes discussion of any individual manner of being. And that's how you can enter into this theistic vision of the cosmos that sees everything as participating in the to be of God, right? And it's that understanding of who God is as the fullness of being, the fullness of existence, ipsum esse subsistens, to use St. Thomas Aquinas' Latin, subsisting being itself, in and through whom everything participates
Mm-hmm.
for its received existence. It's this way of talking about God, this participatory cosmos that we live in, that was that alone was able to open me up to considering a theistic way of looking at the world again.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
when you consider God through this metaphysical lens, you come to realize that everything has to be subjected to this uh, foundational and central notion of all intelligibility, of all understanding,
Mm.
everything. In other words, you can't even look at a leaf falling from the sky and not consider God.
Yeah.
You can't move your hand without seeing it as having its origin in in the source of being.
Mm.
And we can talk maybe a little bit about the mechanics of that later,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but
Beautifully
the point
stated.
is, yeah, like this way of viewing the cosmos is inescapably and thoroughly, without residue, theistic.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so this is why I think that, and this is the way of talking about God that you only find if you dig into, I would say, um, the classical tradition of philosophy that was picked up and later refined by the Catholic intellectual tradition.
Yeah.
The Catholic intellectual tradition, and sure, it has its complements as well in the Muslim world, and at least in the medieval Muslim world, but not so much anymore.
Sure.
But it was really the Catholic intellectual tradition through the Middle Ages that brought um, the, this Platonic and Aristotelian way of viewing the cosmos into its greatest refinement.
Yeah.
And um
Can I ask a
and
question
so
here? Can I
yeah,
ask you?
yeah,
I
absolutely.
want to give a little demonstration. You tell me if you think it's faulty. Consider me one of your catechetical students right now. To kind of illustrate what you're talking about, you were saying we can't just start with the particulars. So, like a particular would be, my hand, this mic, my coffee cup, right? These are particulars. And so, what you're talking about is my hand is obviously interacting with this coffee cup, which is producing a shadow on this mic, which is transmitting. I mean, so these are all particular things, and yet they are all sharing something that binds them together such that we are perceiving them interacting in a way. There's something that is shared between them, despite the fact that they look separate and completely individuated. But for them to even be experienced on the same existential plane, so to speak, requires something else. And as you're talking about, that would be the subsistent being. Does that kind of, what do you think of that kind of, way of articulating it? I'm trying to think of how to make these
Yeah.
like very large concepts accessible to people who maybe don't know about this stuff. But it's like, what allows this cup and this microphone in my hand, to exist together, to interact on the same level? There's something else beyond those individual elements. Is that basically what you're saying?
Right. Yeah, precisely. It's recognizing the underlying principle, the source of unity that
Yeah.
underlies all multiplicity.
Yeah.
Like
Exactly.
to get at to use some classical language for that.
Yep.
And this is what really preoccupied the minds of the Platonists, uh, uh, was and the pre-Socratics, right? The philosophers before Socrates. This was the question that um, most concerned them,
Yeah.
was how do we come to understand, how do we articulate, how do we account for this underlying unity that we all intuit, that we all perceive, um, which underlies the multiplicity that we see in the world.
Yeah.
Because because unity has to proceed ultimately from one. Unity can only proceed from unity. It can't get unity out of multiplicity. That's just philosophically incoherent. So
Yeah.
unity, some principle of unity has to precede, um, ontologically, must precede consideration of multiple
Yeah.
existing things. And
Well, it strikes me there's
it's
a political analog as
yeah,
well that we're so often told diversity is our strength. And it seems that it's trying to do the impossible, what you just said, trying to achieve unity from the diversity. It's like, no, you gotta have a unified element first, and then from that proceeds, the legitimate diversity. Not to get sidetracked or anything, but
right.
when
No,
you
but
said that,
I
it
think we
struck me
all
that's no wonder so much of our
yeah.
politics is nuts right now.
Yeah, and I think we all know this deep down. Like we know that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
We know that an organism, for example, has a unity to it that goes beyond its constitutive parts and biological mechanisms that make it up. Each of its parts is ordered toward the unified whole.
Yeah.
And so this question is really, and this is just, by the way, only one avenue to get to the conclusion that there must be, um, this self-subsisting being that precedes the consideration of all other things.
Yeah.
You can consider it through causality, the fact that things come into existence, um, or not just come into existence through time, but here and now are dependent on other things for their continued existence.
Hmm.
Well, then that presupposes that there's that things don't have existence, things don't have being, by virtue of what they are, by
Mm.
virtue of the nature that they have. And so he asked the question, well, if everything was like that, if everything was such that, um, it doesn't have existence by virtue of what it is, well, then nothing could exist.
Meaning
Nothing
on
could
its
exist at
own,
all.
just to
Right,
dumb it down, to be
right,
meaning to exist on its own.
right.
Yeah.
As part of what it is to be that thing.
Yeah.
Um,
So before
Therefore,
we
there
get
has to
too
be
deep,
some reality
yes.
for whom it can be said that it is by virtue of its nature, so that its
Yes.
essence, what it is, its existence, that it is, are indistinguishable. And
Yes.
that's what we call God. God is he who is, right?
Yeah.
That's I am that
I
I
am that I
am.
am. Yeah.
And it's that discovery, that discovery of that way of talking about God. And then you get into questions of divine simplicity and all these other characteristics of the divinity that logically flow from that starting point,
Mm.
which really blew my mind and revolutionized my whole way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
And at that point, I became a theist pretty much instantly. I
Yeah.
really did. But then we can get into maybe in a second what led me from that to Christianity, because that was a whole other question.
I want to actually go back a little bit further first,
Yeah,
but
please do.
a quick comment. I did not find the new atheist particularly convincing. The more I studied
Mhm.
theology, it was very clear they were not familiar with it.
Right.
Although I hadn't gone deep into Aquinas until really my lead up to conversion the few years before. I wish I had. But it seems that we can get into this as well. I basically wanted to talk about what brought you out of the Catholic faith. But the quick comment here would be that many of these new atheists, I think one of their key errors was they spoke about God as if he was just a supreme being among
Yes.
beings, as
That's
opposed
the
to, as you were
foundational
saying, the
error.
subsistent ground of being itself,
Yes,
which
that is the
leads to
foundational
radically
error.
different conclusions. Yeah.
Yeah, that is absolutely the foundational problem. And I
Yeah.
think, speaking about God in that way makes it come off as if he is some denizen within or even above the created order. That
Yeah.
there is the sky, there's rocks, there's human beings, and then there's God, who's just kind of exists on the same metaphysical plane, but it's just the apex,
Yeah. Yep.
the high
The top
point.
of the pyramid. Yeah.
And there's
Yeah.
a sense in which that's true.
Sure.
There's a sense in which that's true, but it doesn't get to what's most characteristic about divinity, right?
Mm.
That's the hidden gem, I think, that is found in the medieval way of talking about God, that it gets at what is most characteristically divine about God,
Mm.
that he is not one being among others, that he is the fullness of being itself. He is subsisting being itself.
Yeah.
And when you have it, when you understand it in that way, then you can understand at a very foundational level why, therefore, nothing can exist without him.
Yeah.
Because everything
Yep.
else is a participation in being. And if you take away that in which things are participating, then they don't participate in it anymore.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right. And it answers the question of why, like, if, because I think on this other way of thinking about God as like the first domino, in this linear chain of events, if that's how you think about God, well, then it's not inconceivable to think of, okay, but what if God could go out of existence and then everything else would remain?
Yeah. Yep.
If
You don't need the first domino anymore. Well, once it's fallen over.
just like
Yeah.
right, just like I father a son, he fathers a son,
Yep.
like I don't need to exist forever for that
Correct.
chain to keep on going.
Yeah.
And that's because each member has within itself the principle of its own being on this kind of a scheme.
Yeah.
But that is not true when it comes to the act of existence. With the
Yeah.
act of existence, nothing but God has it by virtue of what it is.
Yeah.
In other words, only that for whom it is said that what it is, its essence, and that it is, its existence are one and indistinguishable. Only for that reality um, can it be said that it has within itself the principle of its existence.
Yeah.
And that's just, when you simply say that something's existence comes from without, or comes from outside of it, you are making that claim about these other things, that they don't have existence by virtue of what they are.
Yep.
So considered in and of themselves, by themselves and of themselves, they don't exist.
Yeah.
Right? Like so that's, we are nothing in ourselves apart from the received existence that we have.
Yeah.
And when you consider existence along those lines, then it makes perfect sense why we are constantly dependent upon this bestowal of the divine gift
Yeah.
onto us.
Beautifully
And I think
stated.
and there's a profound spiritual help with that, I think, because what it really shows is that every moment of our being is a vocation to holiness. Every moment
Yeah.
of our being is a call from God to receive the existence of this participation in his being, and to strive further and further and further to attain to the maximum of the perfection allotted to us by him. Right. And that's,
well,
through
you're all seeing why I
sanctification.
love
That's
classical
through-
theists. So that's great. No, that's awesome. My pastor, oh no, it wasn't our pastor, it was another priest at our parish. He recently had a sermon where he was, talking about this. He's in the FSSP, so they're very formed on St. Thomas Aquinas and the Summa.
Yeah.
But he was talking about, he's like, look, if you're alive and existing right now, it is because God is, loving you into existence. He is thinking about you. You are a thought in his proceeding from his divine mind, which, per everything you just said, is a very moving and also duty embracing thought.
Right.
But
now
go ahead.
Notice that everything we just said says nothing about Jesus.
Yeah. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so that's where I was at that time, where I was like, okay, I believe in God. I think these atheists are silly. They're out of their
All
depth.
right. Before we do that, okay, I definitely want to hear this,
problem.
but I want to scoot back a little bit. So it seems there's 3 stages to me. The first stage is we need to talk about that, natural versus revealed, all that. But you fall from the Catholic faith to atheism, then atheism to theism, and then theism to Christianity, right? So can we talk a little bit more about those first 2 stages? Like what brought you from the Catholic faith to atheism? Was it purely intellectual? And my follow-up would be, I will say, and if this wasn't the case with you, that's totally fine. You may have been younger, so maybe there wasn't an issue. I have rarely known anybody who fell from Christianity to atheism or some sort of, so-called progressive form of it, without some sort of sin issue in their life. And if that was the case with you, I'm not going to ask what it was. But did that play a role as well? Was it more than just intellectual? Was there a moral element as well?
Well, you know what's funny about that? So the answer is yes.
Okay.
I think that certainly, not wanting to give up sin, not wanting
Sure.
to fight against sin. I mean, that was certainly a emotional motivator.
Sure.
But you know what's funny is like as I was an atheist, I began to become pretty convinced of like Catholic moral philosophy
Really?
before even accepting the existence of God, just because, like, over time, for example, like, I was always pro-life. I
Hmm.
tried to be pro-choice for a little while, but it just didn't make any sense to me. So
Yeah.
I always hung on to that. And then just on other issues, I mean, it's certainly not perfectly aligned with what the church teaches about
Sure.
morality, but I certainly saw the church as making more sense than the secular world.
Well, that's very
And that,
inconvenient for an atheist.
yeah, but well, the thing is, like, when you're an atheist, it's like, okay, if I mess up, I don't really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So sure, that's certainly like a comfort of remaining an
Sure.
atheist. But just like in my mind, like I did become pretty easily convinced of like Aristotelian ethics. And I remember looking up on the computer, like I was in like the school library, and I was looking up, can an atheist be a Thomist?
Huh.
Because I was reading into
Wow.
Thomas's ethics,
Yeah.
like Aquinas's ethics, and I'm like, this makes a lot of sense. Just it's kind of like very commonsensical about respecting our nature,
Yeah.
about the duties that we owe other people, the virtues. Speaking of ethics in terms of virtue, I thought that made a whole lot of sense. So I actually ended up becoming like opposed to homosexuality,
Sure.
opposed to these other things. But of course, this was very shortly before I began to accept the existence of God. So it was a gradual process, but it is kind of interesting to note that, at least for some people, like you can actually come to terms, I guess, with the church's moral teachings before even considering the
Oh,
existence
yeah.
of God,
Well, the church's
which
moral
is kind of interesting.
teachings, as far as I'm aware, are pretty much all natural law. I mean, the things that most people
Yeah,
think of as Catholic. I mean, there's lots of, let's just use it, an issue that the church is perhaps most unique on in terms of its rigidity, as some say, is contraception and,
right.
all of its concomitant issues like IVF and whatnot. Um, you know, Many people will, frame the Catholic stance on this as inherently religious. And we would say, no, this is just natural law. You don't need to even be a Catholic to
Right.
realize the truth of these things.
Like my problem coming from like that atheist perspective was these practices, whether it's homosexuality or contraception, it just seemed irrational to me.
Yeah.
Like irrational in action, like irrationality in action. And
So how did
so
you
I
fall
kind
into
of came to
atheism?
this.
I'm a little unclear on that
Yeah,
part. Like, how did you fall from your
yeah,
Catholic faith to not believing? Were
right.
there a series of catalyzing events, or was it a sort of slow, degeneration?
It wasn't that slow. It was like, um, I think the first domino to fall, I guess, was kind of just encountering a lot of these different atheists on YouTube who were really attacking theistic arguments, and I just didn't know how to respond to any of them. And so I'm like, well, if I don't have any justification for what I believe in, I'm not gonna
Yeah.
persist in that.
Did you stop
And
going to
I would,
mass?
well, no, actually, my mother took me to mass at the time, so
Okay.
I was actually still going, but I
Okay.
just wasn't believing. There's actually never a point in my time where I just didn't go.
Interesting.
Um, yeah, yeah, and I never resented my mom for taking
Yeah.
me. I just kind of went,
I'm sure she's
and I'm
thrilled
glad she did
now
because
to see where you've
oh
ended
yeah,
up.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's been like 10 years since my reversion now, so it's
Yeah.
been.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I would say just because I had always had this bent toward philosophy, and any kind of thought world that I entered into, I kind of just went all in on.
Okay.
So,
Yep.
just over this process of kind of deconstructing the worldview that I had, yeah, I just kind of became an atheist pretty quickly.
And a lot of the new
And
atheists have superficially
yeah,
appealing rhetoric. I mean, I'll give,
oh, for
Christopher
sure.
Hitchens
Yeah,
was awful on theology and a number of things, but he actually did have a pretty pro-life stance, like you were just saying. He was an atheist, avowed
yeah,
atheist, but I don't think it was fully Catholic in that sense, natural law, but it was very close.
no,
He actually
but he
talked about
was,
he couldn't justify abortion.
and he was a pretty good rhetorician too. I mean,
Oh, he was hilarious.
so he
That's the thing, is
spoke,
he was
yeah,
hilarious. Absolutely
spoke very
hilarious.
persuasively.
Yeah. Yeah, I loved how funny he is. I mean, even when he's making jokes about religion, I still find myself chuckling if I see some of those old videos because he was just very funny. Richard Dawkins
Yeah.
doesn't have a humorous bone in his body, and
No.
Sam Harris is well, you know, I hope Sam
So
comes
Sam
around.
Harris is just like Brian from Family Guy. That's kind of who he is.
Who thinks he's
it's like-
Einstein? Who thinks he's
yeah,
Einstein?
and Brian is of course an insufferable character that everyone hates. So
Yeah, it's well, we do a great rosary campaign every week, and Sam Harris should maybe be a good target because Our Lady likes praying for impossible cases. My own sister kind of had an incredible conversion from LGBTQ. She almost added the T on there by surgically altering, and just an amazing story. She's working for Eternal Christendom now, but we can pray for Sam Harris. Maybe we'll do that in one of them. Okay, so you're falling into atheism. How long were you an atheist, you think?
just a couple years.
Okay.
Just a few years. Well, what's funny is the wall begun to crack really when I encountered Edward Fazer's article.
Oh yeah.
Titled "So You Think You Understand the Cosmological Argument," and of course, me thinking, "Well, of course I understand. I've refuted this thing all the time. I've been in the YouTube comments demolishing it." But then I read through it and I'm like, "Well, okay. I guess I was only exposed to William Lane Craig's presentation of it and his version of it. The Kalam argument. I don't know if we need to get into what that entails, but
sure, if you want to.
But his version of it, which is just to say, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe at the Big Bang began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Therefore, God.
Sure.
That was just never really persuasive to me because, again, it didn't get into the metaphysical roots of those questions.
Sure.
And so, but when I read Fazer's article, I'm like, wait a second. Are you saying
And Fazer's
that
Catholic, just so people know. Ed
Right.
Fazer. Yeah.
And so I'm saying, are you saying, so I read through this article, I'm like, are you saying that even if the world never began to exist, it would still require a source of its existence? And that's what he was saying. He said Thomas Aquinas taught that. And I was like, well, how does that make any sense? I thought that if the world had always existed, then that's game over for theism. So that led me into this other avenue of talking about causation. That causality is not just a linear A causes B, causes C, causes D across time. It really has like the more foundational dimension. There's 4 kinds of causes: material, formal, efficient, final, and there's this deeper way of talking about causality where things where things derive from another, but that can be in time, but it can also be in the essential order of being.
Well, what connects the causes? Again, like we said before, is like what allows cause A to lead to effect B, which then becomes cause C to lead to effect D. Like what allows them to exist together and connected in some way.
And also here and now, what grounds the existence? What is the foundation? So speaking of causality in terms of foundations, with or without a beginning in time, that was worldview altering to me. I was like, wow, that's a very unique way of talking about it that I had never thought of before. And that's what led me into reading more into Aquinas' metaphysics. I had already liked Aquinas' ethics, St. Thomas's ethics. I had already liked that. I'd been drawn to that. But then I'm like, okay, well, I guess these ethics are really rooted in a more fundamental way of viewing the world, and I had better become acquainted with that. So just over time, I really began to embrace everything we had just talked about, right? Like this way of talking about God. Divine simplicity was a big one for me.
Acquainted with Aquinas. That sounds like maybe a good podcast name. You should do. Acquainted with Aquinas. So it was Fazer then. Fazer like kind of jump-started the process to get you to theism.
I'd say so. Yeah.
Well, God bless Ed Fazer. I know he's done that for so many. He's a Catholic philosopher. He's out here in California, the People's Republic, which us natives love, regardless of its People's Republicness. But
he's a revert
that's great.
From atheism as well.
So what was that?
He's a revert from atheism.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So.
Okay. So he gets you to get into the metaphysics of Thomas. What happens next?
Yeah, and then that really, because you can't accept the metaphysics of St. Thomas without accepting, because God is the foundation of his metaphysics, right? Yeah. His understanding of being is inextricably linked with his understanding of the divine being,
Mm.
like participated being versus unparticipated being. God is being itself
Yeah.
unparticipated.
Yeah.
And so that really just, like I said, it changed my whole way of viewing the cosmos. I had come to very quickly then accept his understanding of the existence of God as pure act. And
Tell the audience what
so,
pure act is. Let's talk about act and potency. And you had mentioned Aristotle's four causes. Can you give a brief tutorial on these things for the members of the audience who maybe have never heard of it?
yeah, sure. So like this idea of God as pure act. So whenever we encounter, I think the best way to approach it, or to get started with thinking about it, is to take the example of change happening in the world. So it could be any kind of change. It can be local change where something moves location,
So
or it
me
can be
moving
some
my coffee
qualitative
cup,
change.
that's a local
Right,
change.
right.
Yeah.
Or it
Yeah.
can be some qualitative change in a thing, right?
My skin
Or,
turning
or
red from getting sunburned in Hawaii. Something
exactly,
like that.
right.
Yeah.
And so in any instance of change, you have to ask the question, um, you have the state of being, and then you have the state of non-being, and then you have this other state of being.
Hmm.
And now Parmenides was a pre-Socratic philosopher, and he rejected that this really happened in the world because he believed that being itself was static.
Hmm.
It can't. Being cannot become non-being.
Hmm.
So becoming is impossible.
So how did he
And so
explain change? Like if he sees things moving, like
you'd see it as illusory. He just
interesting.
he just didn't believe it happened because of his commitment to this rational consideration of the immobility of being.
Interesting.
And so, and that's contrasted against Heraclitus, who believed that change was all that you had in the world. You didn't
Yep.
have this static. You didn't have any staticity to being.
The river
And then
analogy that anytime you
right,
put
exactly,
your
can't
foot
step
in the
into the same
river,
river
yeah,
twice.
yeah.
So Aristotle comes along and he allows us basically to reconcile these two worldviews: the Parmenidean worldview that clings to the fact that being has permanence to it, that that there's a staticity to being, this underlying permanence, but also embracing what Heraclitus embraced, which was what the senses are telling us, that things are changing into one state to another. There is this seemingly intermediate break between the state of one thing
Mm.
versus the state of another in the same reality.
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
so Aristotle is able to reconcile these two things by introducing this distinction between actuality and potentiality, between act and potency.
Mm.
And so each being has its actual being, but it also has within itself states that could be realized by some principle of actuality, by some principle of actual being. Um, and so God, um, we would say God is pure actuality. He is nothing but actual being.
Mm-hmm.
And that um, allows divisions between actuality and potentiality to both be rooted in the real,
Yeah.
essentially. So, so that's
This would be
this
the
understanding of God,
ground
right?
of causality, as you were talking
The
about.
ground of causality, the
Yeah.
ground of change. Um,
Is
Whereas in
act.
everything else is some admixture between some limited actuality and some limited potentiality.
Yep.
God is pure actuality that grounds within himself the possibility for all of these modes of being. And so in a certain sense, Parmenides is right, but what Parmenides applies to the being that we encounter, you really have to apply to God.
Yeah.
It's God who is that permanent, unchanging life of being. And everything else is subject to change, decay, um, going in existence and out of existence. So yeah, that's what I would say about that.
So would Parmenides have been? It's been a while since I've read the Pre-Socratics. Would he have? And it's funny because when you read them, I mean, I think there's so many ways Aristotle has affected our Western mind. that you're dealing with the pre-Socratics before him, and it's kind of like, where are they coming up with this stuff? But as you're explaining it very well, so would Parmenides have been basically a materialist, an atomist of some kind?
Parmenides would have been the opposite.
Okay.
It's hard to say because the pre-Socratics, you really don't have this. Like, I wouldn't call any of the pre-Socratics materialists in the sense that we would
Okay.
use the term today, because
Sure.
even though they
Sure.
did believe, like for example, Thales was the first who believed that water was the principle of all things,
Yeah.
was the
Yep.
underlying principle, and then Heraclitus believed it was fire.
Yeah.
But I still wouldn't call them materialists because they are still trying to find that principle of unity beneath the multiplicity that we experience, that we encounter.
Yeah.
Parmenides, I would say, is kind of the first gateway into Platonism and
Okay.
into the immaterial, because he kind of sees the whole changing world that we encounter as illusory on some level. So I think
Yeah.
Parmenides had one of the first great insights into transcendent being.
So
So
this may be
he was kind of
where.
this giant leap forward.
Sure. Okay. So this may be a good spot. I wanted to ask you, your name is classical theist. So what, because you, I mean, it includes many things, but certainly
Yeah.
part of it is realism, what we call realism. So I want you to explain that to the audience. But realism, one of the notions it proceeds from, as far as I'm aware, is that our senses are reliable, and that for our senses to perceive anything in reality, you would be able to explain it far better. But that is something that to some extent or another is reliable, and that sense experience is a viable ground for discerning reality itself.
Yeah.
Whereas actually a lot of modern philosophies, I would say a lot of it stems from Protestantism in various ways, but a lot of modern philosophies don't even necessarily accept that, which is why I think we have a lot of these, we're in a matrix, we're in a simulation sort of theories these days. But
Right.
Could you say, what is the defining feature of classical theism as opposed to a non-classical theism?
Yeah. So this distinction between classical theism and then the other term is what they call theistic personalism. It was kind of introduced to us by a philosopher by the name of Brian Davies.
Okay.
And it's not to say that this distinction perfectly maps on to the state of the debate and to the state of disputation about these questions. I mean, every means, I think, of categorizing people's intellectual positions is always going to be on some level
Sure.
inadequate, right?
Sure.
There's going to be exceptions, there's going to be nuances that you're
Sure.
not getting, but broadly, it kind of just has to do with recognizing that there is like there's a common underlying thread that links together um, Plato and Aristotle and then St. Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, their way of talking about the divine that is quite different from how I feel like a lot of modern people like to talk
Kierkegaard,
about
perhaps.
God. Perhaps. I'm also thinking even of William Lane Craig, and
Sure.
I think one of the foundational ideas that marks that distinction is our insistence on divine simplicity.
Okay.
That, I think, is one of the most defining and distinguishing characteristics between these two ways of talking about God.
Can you unpack that a bit?
And I think, yeah, absolutely, because I think it is very important. And the moment I was sold on divine simplicity, I was like, okay, there's really no way out of theism anymore.
Okay.
And the reason is because if you accept that God is the ground of all being, that He is pure being itself, what that means is that He has to ground the causal contingency of everything else. Now, what is, I guess, one of the primary means by which we recognize something as contingent versus not contingent, dependent for its existence on something versus not dependent for its existence on something?
Yeah.
And I would say it's whether that thing is composed of constitutive parts.
Okay.
whether the thing is made up of stuff. And it doesn't have to be physical stuff. It could be immaterial stuff, like properties
Sure.
or
A
something like
spirit.
that. Yeah, spirit and matter together, or just some composition of act and potency, some
Yeah.
composition, and in the angels, for example, some composition between existence and essence, some composition that constitutes a thing, without which the thing would not exist.
Can you
Um,
tell again? Because I know that
yeah,
many in the audience will be maybe a little bit confused. Existence and essence. What's the difference between those two things? Why are they different in angels, and why are they the same in God?
yeah. See that actually gets to the heart of Saint Thomas Aquinas's argument for God from essence and existence, because he lays this out in his treatise De Ente et Essentia concerning being and essence.
Mm.
I believe, I could have this wrong, but I think he wrote this treatise when he was 19, maybe 20 or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So
Ripe
really,
old
like,
age.
yeah. So I mean, if you're that age and you compose something like that, it's like, wow, you
Yeah.
could just die shortly after that and still leave your mark on the world.
Sure.
But no, he kind of stumbles upon this I think greatest argument for God when talking about angels, because he essentially has to ask the question, um, what is it about an angel that makes it dependent for its existence? In other
Mm.
words, and that's really getting to the question of what is most characteristically divine about God. That's something we mentioned earlier.
Yep.
But I think that's the most important question
To
to
distinguish him
answer.
from
It's like,
creatures.
right, like
Yeah.
what is the most fundamental distinguishing characteristic of divinity insofar as he is divine?
Yeah.
And he would say that an angel, so an angel's not made up of material stuff, and an angel um, uh, isn't subject to the same kind of change and corruption that physical things are. And
Yeah.
so you ask the question, okay, well, then why couldn't they be the foundation of everything on some
Mm.
level, right? Like why couldn't the whole world just originate in a pantheon
Sure.
of deities that we would just consider the angels? And
Polytheism.
and, and Saint,
Yeah.
right, and Saint Thomas's answer to that, and so some Aristotle scholars even say that Aristotle believed that there was more than one pure act.
Mm.
I don't think that's true, but there are some Aristotle scholars who say that, and I think Aristotle, if that's your version of Aristotle, he would be put in that camp.
Okay.
And so Saint Thomas answers the question, and he says that, well, in an angel, you still have this fundamental distinction between the angel's essence, what it is, and its act of existence. You still
Mm.
have that distinction. In other words, th- there's this non-identity between the angel's essence and its act of existence. In other words, what it is and that it is. That's kind of that's in a nutshell. That's the difference between a thing's essence and its existence. What it is its essence.
Yeah.
That it is its existence. I mean, we intuit this phenomenon every day, right? I can have an image in my head of what a dinosaur is. Doesn't mean that dinosaurs exist in reality.
Yeah.
But we're still speaking intelligibly about something
Unless
when
you're
we mention
talking with
dinosaurs.
Jordan Peterson about dragons or something. I'm just kidding.
Right. I mean, but even that, you have like you do have there like a
This is a conversation you had with Richard Dawkins. And,
yeah,
we should have
right.
another
I
conversation
watched that.
at
Yeah,
some point about Jordan Peterson, because I think he's done a lot of good, but he's also, and I appreciate so much about him. He actually follows me on X, which kind of blew me away. We've met before, but
yeah,
I'm very disappointed with his lack of what feels like a total lack of follow through at this point with some of it. So that's another discussion. But yeah, I'm referring to a discussion he had with Richard
yeah.
Dawkins where he was making a very strange argument about dragons and them kind of existing based on a sort of Jungian notion that well they're in the mind and it's very strange. But
Right. Well,
yeah,
that's exactly like so. That would be what St. Thomas would call a being of reason.
yeah,
So, but even that is, you know, an essence of the mind, right?
Yeah.
Like within the mind and of the mind. So you
A
have this
unicorn. You
distinguishing
can think of a unicorn in your
Yeah,
mind. You have an
exactly.
essence in mind when you think of unicorn. That doesn't mean
Right.
the unicorn is existing.
Right. And so
Yeah.
you have this fundamental distinction. And so in the angel, what that has to mean then, if the essence is distinct, really distinct from its existence, then that means that that the essence receives existence from without itself, from outside of itself.
Yeah.
And once you acknowledge that, then you realize that if everything were like that, then nothing could exist, because existence would be endlessly derivative. It would
Yeah.
be endlessly received, and existence is not something that can be endlessly received. And so you have to have some reality for whom it can be said existence is unreceived in every
Yeah.
respect.
Yeah.
And this is the reality for whom essence and existence is identical. The very essence of that reality is none other than its act of to be itself.
Yeah.
And that's what we call God. And that's St. Thomas's argument for God in the De Ante et Essentia. I think that's the most fundamental way of discovering God. Gavin Kerr, who's a great philosopher, Thomistic philosopher, he calls this Aquinas' way to God. And I'd recommend you getting his book. That's literally what the title is.
What's his name
Way to
again?
God. Gavin Kerr.
How do you spell that?
Kerr.
Okay. Aquinas'
but-
way
but-
to God.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so yeah, that's I guess I don't remember the train of thought that led us here, but
We were
but
talking
that's-
about divine simplicity and how it ultimately, I think, took you from theism
Right.
to Christianity.
right.
I'm sorry, atheism to classical theism to Christianity. Just how divine simplicity played
Right.
a role
Exactly.
in this.
And so divine simplicity is very key here, because in the angel, so even in the angel, the highest realities that we can think of on this plane of existence, there's still composition. See,
Yeah.
that's what really makes them non-divine, is this composition in them.
Meaning they're composed of different elements. They're not the same thing
Right.
throughout. Yeah.
Exactly. Whereas in God, this is just not true. His essence is his act of to be itself, and so he is within himself uncomposed. So he is absolutely simple. And the First Vatican Council defines this dogmatically.
Yeah.
And so that's unique, or not, it's not unique, but it is essential
Yeah.
to the Catholic faith. And a lot of modern ways of talking about God don't acknowledge that. They don't like that idea. William Lane Craig hates the idea of divine simplicity.
Why? Why do you think so?
Because they think that it inhibits him, or it somehow makes him unable to relate to us, or they just think it's really weird, or they think it's somehow at odds with the Trinity, when it isn't, because the persons of God are not parts.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, this way of speaking about God as if he is just the greatest being, the apex of the pyramid, that is like I said, I think it's the main presentation of talking about God. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who were at the forefront of defending Christianity against the new atheists, they came out of that milieu.
Yeah.
They came out of that intellectual milieu, and that's why I was just never really convinced.
Let me ask you a question.
Of their presentation.
And if this would get too sidetracked, just let me know. How much... Because, I primarily focus on patristic stuff and history stuff, and so I know a decent amount of the, theistic apologetics, but not nearly as much as you. How much of this issue it's increasingly struck me the further I get into being Catholic. It'll be 6 years for me and fully in communion with the church in July of 2025. It increasingly strikes me that so much of what we're dealing with these new atheist objections and whatnot stems from Protestantism, because I've just met numerous people over the years who would make these sort of new atheist arguments, and then I would respond to them with this sort of Thomistic approach. They've never heard of it the vast majority of the time. And they are speaking about God as if he is the supreme being among beings. And
Sure.
and I know that, not all Protestants reject philosophy. We don't want to misrepresent, but
No,
there
of course not.
was from the very beginning a tense relationship between, fideistic approaches to Christianity and the life of the mind, rationality. So how much do you think this
Right.
predicament is related to Protestantism?
So I'd say on some ways yes, and in some ways no. So
Okay.
let me explain that a little bit.
Yeah.
No, in the sense that like if you talk to even Martin Luther, if you talk to like the early reformers, they would have upheld divine simplicity,
Sure. Sure.
and they would have accepted these things. However, in divorcing themselves from the medieval refinement of the patrimony that was left to the church from the fathers of the church,
Yeah.
and rejecting and trying to divorce themselves from that continuous handing off of the baton. I think um, inevitably there was always going to be this tendency for them to recreate to like recreate their intellectual frameworks within which they would understand the scriptures,
Yeah.
um, divorced from the medieval commentators, divorced from the scholastic commentators. And now you do have, of course, Reformed scholasticism, some variant of it, but that never really caught all that much steam.
Yeah.
And
Turretin,
right,
Chemnitz, those
right.
kind of guys. Yeah.
But even they are very skeptical of Aquinas, of St. Thomas, and St.
Yeah.
Bonaventure, and Duns Scotus, and very skeptical of that patrimony.
What about
So,
Aristotle? What did they think of Aristotle?
I mean, from what I understand, Luther hated Aristotle.
No, I know Luther did, but what about Turretin
Right.
and Chemnitz? Do you know in their case?
On that level of detail, I'm not entirely sure. I imagine
Okay.
that they probably would have accepted, Aristotelian categories of logic and
Yeah.
things like that, and maybe probably, but they just didn't lean all that much into metaphysical questions. I
Yeah.
feel like, to your point about fideism, I think that inevitably caught more steam, partly because of their understanding of the human person as totally depraved,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That all this embrace of classical philosophy is just kind of like um, the apotheosis of the human mind or
Yeah.
something, right? It's the vain philosophies that Paul
Yep.
talked about, right?
Yep. Yep.
And you always had little voices like that throughout all the Middle Ages.
Sure.
So it was very controversial, Aristotle being introduced, reintroduced into the Western world was itself a controversy. St. Thomas
Sure.
Aquinas himself was condemned by Bishop Etienne.
Yeah.
And so those condemnations had to be lifted, and so even like within the Catholic world, it wasn't uncontroversial.
Yeah.
And Pope Gregory the Ninth, I believe, had to write a letter to the universities to not get too wrapped up in um, Aristotelianism.
Yeah.
So it's not so I'm not trying to make the point that the Protestants hate philosophy, but the Catholics have always loved philosophy.
Sure.
I think it's undeniable to say that the perennial philosophy was more welcomed. It took on, I think, a greater life within the intellectual environment of medieval Christendom.
Sure.
I think that's undeniable.
Sure.
In a way that I think just did not continue to flourish among Protestant reformers.
Yeah.
And I think that partly led to just somewhat of an intellectually impoverished way of approaching the whole question of God.
Yeah.
Which I think is why um, today you just can't point to very many Protestants who are advancing this way of viewing the world, this
Yeah.
way of viewing God, this
Yeah.
way of talking about God.
Well, it's interesting because I know Luther, he referred to that horror reason. He hated Aristotle. And by the way, I think it's very important what you just pointed out that, yes, the reception of Aristotle was not without its controversy, even within the church. And when we even say reception of Aristotle, we're not he's not a saint. He's not a church father.
Right.
We're talking about certain fundamental notions that he had. And but another thing, my understanding at least of Luther is that his teacher, Gabriel Biel, I think was his name, was a nominalist, and we won't get into the nominalism thing today. That'd be a whole other discussion. But
sure.
My understanding is Luther read hardly anything, if anything, of St. Thomas. That's my understanding, which is really interesting because of your conversion from atheism to theism and ultimately back to your Catholic faith. And I know that you are not alone. In fact, it seems like there are many Protestants right now, especially among some Reformed. They're going back to Thomas. I know, not to get sidetracked with Mr. White, but I know people like James White are really upset about this because they think that this will invariably take them, back to apostate Catholicism, which is probably true.
Right.
If you take it out, yeah, exactly. And so it's just, it's very interesting because I guess I'm continually impressed by the ability of St. Thomas's system to synthesize all truth. And when it's abandoned, sort of Thomistic realism, or not known, it allows, you fell from your Catholic faith. Luther fell from his Catholic faith. I'm not saying that everybody who falls from a Catholic faith, maybe didn't know Thomas per se, although it probably would have helped them avoid it if they didn't. But it's just interesting to me, these correlations. I'm not necessarily claiming causation because,
sure.
At the time of Luther, I don't think Aquinas, I think that the declarations of his authority, his common authority for the whole church came later after Luther, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But it is interesting. And so, what would be, this is a little bit of a side topic, but since we're talking about Aristotle really quick, you'll often hear from Protestants that that some of them at least can believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, but not transubstantiation. And they'll say, well, these categories of substance and accidents, from Aristotle didn't exist in the patristic period, and so transubstantiation is bunk and whatnot. I know that's a whole topic, probably, maybe worth an interview in itself, but what would be your quick response to that? And to the extent the church has dogmatized the term transubstantiation, what does it mean that the church has dogmatized that? How much of Aristotle does it entail, imbibing, just anything related to that? I think it'd be very interesting for people.
Sure. Right. Like I'm not going to sit here and say that like you have to accept word for word like St. Thomas's articulation of it
Sure.
in the third part of the Summa. However, there is, as far as I understand, and I believe I could be wrong on this. The fathers better than I do, but there's Clement of. It's either Clement of Alexandria or it's Cyril of Alexandria use a Greek complement to that Latin term. Like
I've definitely seen the word. I think it's Cyril of Alexandria. I think it's a little later, but I've seen terms. Oh, I'm forgetting what it was, but it was something like transmutation or something like that.
Like metausion,
but it had a composition of trans and some other word that was
sure.
It was eerily close to transubstantiation.
Right, exactly, and well, first of all, let's back up a second because if somebody just wants to pick on Aristotle's usage of substance and accident, they have to explain why they're doing that because the early councils are just immersed, drowning, as it were, in philosophical lexicon. Right? You can't read the early councils that we all pretty much agree on without recourse to these very rarefied and abstract concepts about homoousion, about substance and hypostasis. And even between Nicaea and Chalcedon, there's this development of philosophical refinement that tries to get at extent to which the persons of the Trinity are three hypostases.
Yep.
And
Yep.
there's that whole debate, right?
Let's emphasize this point really quick, just so people understand the importance
yeah,
of what you just
I
said.
think we should.
Because many people will go after Aristotle in general. Many Protestants will go after Aristotle in general. They'll go after the term transubstantiation and the concepts of substance and accident, which are actually extremely simple and I would say almost commonsensical comments, which I want you to go into. But the point that you're making, that classical theist is making, is that if you're going to do that, many of these, I'd say the vast majority of these same Protestants would say they accept the Creed of Nicaea. But if they're going to attack this very idea as if it's some purely novel medieval invention, they've cut off the branch for accepting the Nicene Creed, right? Because of similar sorts of concerns.
Exactly. Like if it's the rationalism you're concerned about, well then you have to say the same thing about those early councils.
Yeah.
And if it's not the rationalism of it, and I'm using rationalism in that pejorative sense that they would think about it, but if it's not the rational aspect, well then why are you just picking on Aristotle?
Yeah.
Like what is Aristotle somehow cursed in a way that Plato wasn't, right?
Yep.
I mean, it's inconsistent thinking, right? Yep. So that's the first point we got to make.
Sure.
The second point, though, is that, like I said, I mean, you don't have to be like a devotee of Aristotle to just kind of accept fundamentally the notion that there's this reality of substance that we all accept. We have to accept if we're going to accept those early councils, which kind of presupposes, yes, a realist understanding of the cosmos, and that the substance. And maybe you don't use the word accident. Maybe you use the word qualities. I don't really care what word you use for the purposes of this discussion.
Sure.
But non-substantial qualities. Let's just and everybody is okay with the word quality.
Yeah.
So just think of non-substantial qualities, that those remain, but the reality, the inner reality, the substance changes is from bread and wine.
Let me pause you really quick. This is great. Let's do a little bit more remedial education for some of the audience really quick. What is substance and what is accident? And give a few examples if you don't mind.
Yeah. So there's a really long answer that I'm not.
We may not get to the papacy today. We'll see. Maybe that'll have to go to a part 2. But we'll see.
So what I'm going to say is simplified to the point where I understand that people in the comments want to nuance it a little bit more.
Sure.
But because there's many ways of talking about substance.
Sure.
But for the purposes of this discussion, I guess we would just say that the substance of a thing is the being that stands on its own, that you can't predicate of another thing.
Okay.
So it's a being by itself. The accidents would be the qualities that you speak of or about the being in question. So, yes, it can be color, it can be shape, but more fundamentally, it's anything said of and about the substance of or about the thing that exists in itself.
So, can you give us some examples separated from bread and wine? What would be some examples just to have the audience have a sense of what you're talking about?
Yeah. So
again, we're keeping it simple. So
just use the example of a human being, right? Use the example of a human being.
Yeah.
We speak of all of the qualities that kind of make us up, but on the most fundamental level, we say, okay, I am me, and I can speak of the arm or the leg of me, or the intellect or the will of me, but if I'm just talking about me, full stop, period, that is the direct subject of existence. Okay, that's the subject that immediately receives existence. That because you wouldn't say the me of something else.
Yeah,
because I am the reality.
The me of the arm or the me of the eye.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. I have existence in myself. And so the subject of the direct and immediate subject of existence is what we would call substance. And so in Eucharist, we have the bread and the wine, and the substance of the bread and the substance of the wine is changed into the body and blood of Christ, and by concomitance, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, the whole Christ.
Yeah.
Christ, insofar as he's considered as the subject of existence. And the qualities by divine miracle remain. And it is by divine miracle.
Let's use a different, so just really quick, let's make it, I want to give one or two more examples just so the audience understands. So this cup, it's glass, porcelain, perhaps. Tell us what the substance of this cup would be and some of its accidents, just so people understand on a more basic level.
See, this is why we need to nuance it further, because
fair enough.
It would the substance is the porcelain. It's not the cup.
Or how about maybe something just created like a tree? If you have a tree,
there you go.
Maybe that'd be easier.
Because we want to make this distinction.
Because it's not manufactured, right?
Right, exactly. So a tree, the substance is the tree. Insofar as we consider the tree as the direct and immediate subject of being.
Is it wood? Would it be wood and leaves, or is substance?
No, it's the unity. Unity of the tree, because it's an organism, right?
Okay.
It's a. I think a great way to think about it is an irreducible whole, an irreducible unity that has being in itself. And so for the tree, that's why I say for the cup, it's porcelain, because the unity is artificial.
Yeah.
It's imposed by
it's
the mind
designed, and there's carving, and yeah.
Right. And so that's why that's not an irreducible unity. That's a unity that has its origin in the human mind. Which is why we call it a cup.
So what about bread? Because, bread requires wheat and yeast and water and baking. So what about bread in that case?
Well, the bread is still, it may take human hands to bring that about.
Sure.
But
that's what the Noah's Ark Mass says, right? Work of human hands, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It is the work of human hands. But I mean, just like we would say the same thing about like a domesticated cow.
Yeah.
Or like
sure.
a domesticated animal.
I'm not objecting to it, to be clear. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But I think that's a great objection, though. So I think the same thing applies to food that is grown.
Okay. We can say the substance of bread is bread. Of wine is wine. And the accidents, like on a tree, for example, what would be an example of an accident?
I would say the leaves.
The color.
Its shape, its color.
Yeah.
Its characteristics, its physical, because the substance is really immaterial.
Okay.
Like the substance of a thing is immaterial.
Okay.
It's the immaterial principle of unity that underlies the whole thing.
Okay.
That's why we say it only an immaterial reality can be an irreducible whole. Which is why it's very important for us to maintain the sense of realism about things, because this whole distinction between material and is it material or is it immaterial, right? Like it's not a good way to talk about reality, because on this level of thinking, and in this way of thinking, everything is an admixture of the immaterial and the material.
Yeah.
Everything. You can't encounter a thing that is not both immaterial and material, except for the angels.
Yeah. So like with human beings, like the substance of Joshua Charles is man or human being, same as for classical theists. But an accident would be, the color of my hair, the color of your eyes, maybe the length of my arm or the length of your leg or something like that. Right. Would that be?
And if you want to, I'm not going to enumerate them, but if you want to look into it further, Aristotle has 9 categories of accident.
Yeah.
Yep. So it's just like the quality, place, quantity, etc.
Oh, I just want people to understand in the audience, like these are actually really basic. It's like most of us don't think about these things because it's just intrinsic to how we perceive the world. And so Aristotle in many ways is trying to explain the obvious and why it's obvious. Would you say that's a fair?
I think that's a great way to put it, actually.
Yeah.
And you don't even have to, like, maybe you split hairs a little bit with Aristotle's categorization of accidents. That's fine. Doesn't matter. But just accepting that baseline idea that you have the substance of a thing and you have its non-substantial.
Everything
qualities.
has a substance. Everything has accidents or qualities.
And the point I'm making here, though, is that the philosophy helps, but it's really foundationally, the transubstantiation is rooted in the scriptures.
Yeah.
Because Jesus, again, I mean, this is an obvious thing to say, and I know people will maybe object to me saying this in such a, um, I guess, flippant way, I guess. But Jesus says, "This is
Yeah.
my body, hoc est enim corpus meum." I know he didn't speak Latin, but it's, this is my body. So there's a statement of being here, and there's a this he's holding up is my body. The is a statement of substance.
Yeah.
It's a statement of being. It's a statement of what it is.
Yeah.
And so he's saying, this is my body, this is my blood. And the only way to make sense of that without violating the law of non-contradiction is by way of transubstantiation.
Yeah.
And yes, I understand that the early fathers of the church, this term wasn't popularized, but we already said that it has a Greek origin,
Yeah.
as well. There's this metaousios idea, um, but more fundamentally, like, if they hold the real presence, they implicitly hold the transubstantiation.
Yeah.
And unless we, again, going back to our first point, unless you want to just um, eliminate or eradicate all of the Chalcedonian ways of talking about the Trinity or Jesus,
Yeah.
then I think you should be if you're a believer in the real presence, then you should be a believer in this.
Yeah. So it's not really, I mean, to go after Aristotle in this regard is really, it's a red herring. You have to, because at the end of the day, we have to be able to give an account of what substance and accident refer to, that there are qualities of things and the reality of things. And how do you explain that? And these are the words that Aristotle came up with, that many early councils used for other things. But transubstantiation is simply saying that the substance of the bread has changed into the whole Christ, as you said, body, blood, soul, and divinity, while the accidents, meaning its appearance, has not. I mean, we know from our sense experience that that's simply true, that the accidents don't change, right?
And that's by divine miracle, because in everything else, and we don't want to get further into the weeds on it, but we wouldn't say, for example, that the accidents of bread and wine inhere in the substance of Christ.
Oh,
that's
yeah,
not
absolutely.
A correct way to say it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they don't inhere in a substance.
Yeah.
St. Thomas Aquinas says they're suspended by divine power.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's the miracle of it. And to compound the miracle, the substance of Christ is present, and the accidents of Christ are present by virtue of the substance of Christ. So because we're actually encountering the whole Christ, and Christ includes even his accidents.
Yes.
So it's like there's this compounded miraculous event that's happening.
Yeah.
That's the greatest mystery of all mysteries.
Now,
really.
why? Yeah, absolutely. Magnum Mysterium. Why would the Eastern Orthodox, not to get, well, maybe, yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's a longer treatment of this, but why would the Eastern Orthodox object to this, you think?
Well, I think that,
because some of them don't actually. I know that there are some decrees of later Eastern Orthodox councils, Jerusalem or whatnot, that literally use the same term of transubstantiation, and most people don't realize that. You know,
I think they're just being a bit silly, and I'll just be like I think they're being just like reflexively anti-Latin, just for the sake of it. And the reason I say that is because they'll extol somebody like St. John Damascene.
Sure.
Okay, you read St. John Damascene's philosophical chapters, and it's like you're reading a scholastic tome
in the Great Catechism.
Metaphysics. Yeah. Like when you read his philosophical chapters, he actually talks about, okay, what is a substance? What is an accident? He talks about all this, and he goes over Aristotle's 9 categories of accidents, and he gets into even like grammatical philosophy, right?
Wow.
And all sorts of very into the weeds of ontology and metaphysics and philosophy, using Aristotelian notions. Okay,
And I love
so
it's been a while since I've read his catechism. I think it's the catechism, right? And it's wonderful. It's available for free if people want to read it on New Advent or CCEL. I actually wanted to read you something really quick, if that's all right. I ran into this quote. I'm reading. I'm getting pretty close to finishing all 38 volumes of the Schaff set of the Fathers, and it's all behind here, and we've got Catholic University of America there, and it's all there's 3 bookshelves. It's a working library, folks. So, but I ran into this wonderful line from St. Clement of Alexandria. I sent it to a buddy of mine who's studying at DSPT, the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology. And it's from the Stromata. I don't know if you've read the Stromata of St. Clement of Alexandria. It's written about 198 to 203. Mm-hmm. It's just fantastic. He's really talking about the relationship between faith and reason. And it's not quite as refined as we articulate today, but it's still fundamentally the same. So I wanted to read this quote and just have you respond to it if it's all right. Because I put it on our logo page because, the Eternal Christendom logo, it's meant to, proffer a set of propositions, but it's also meant to emphasize the story element of everything, that God prepared the world for the reception of the gospel through things like the philosophy of the Greeks, the Pax Romana, and the laws and institutions of the Roman Empire, obviously through the people of Israel with the prophets and the patriarchs and Moses and whatnot. So you have this extraordinarily providential combination of elements: revealed religion from Israel, reason and philosophy from Greece, and laws and institutions, that pacified 3 continents, not always peacefully, of course, but oftentimes not. But pacified 3 continents: Africa, Asia, and Europe, in the Roman Empire, and that this is part of when Paul talks. I believe it's Galatians 4:4 that Christ came in the fullness of time. This is part of what he's referring to, that each of these elements had been providentially prepared and then were united by the assumption of human nature, by the divine logos, and the civilization that created. And so this is the reason philosophy element, but this is the line from St. Clement of Alexandria, the Stromata, book 1, chapter 16, for anybody who wants to look it up. But if the Hellenic, meaning the Greek, philosophy comprehends not the whole extent of the truth, and besides is destitute of strength to perform the commandments of the Lord, yet it prepares the way for the truly royal teaching, training in some way or other, and molding the character and fitting him who believes in providence for the reception of the truth.
Yeah, and I'd like to
Isn't that extraordinary?
Yeah.
I mean, you even see grace in there. That he says it's destitute of strength to perform the commandments of the Lord. So,
right.
And one thing I heard as a Protestant so often was that, well, you tell me what your experience has been. This is anecdotal, and we're down to about 15 minutes or so. So I don't think we're going to get to the papacy today. We'll have to do that on a follow-up interview. This has been great. But one of the things you'll often hear, I think with the internet, the church fathers are getting out there a lot more. And so many Protestants, there are many Catholics falling away. It may even be a net loss, at least in our country. But there are many Protestants who are coming to the Catholic faith. They're going to Eastern Orthodoxy sometimes because they're discovering the fathers. And they're discovering that the Christian religion has been very dissimilar to Protestantism since the beginning.
Yeah.
And so, but one of the things you'll hear constantly is that the fathers were corrupted by pagan philosophy and whatnot. What's so fascinating about St. Clement of Alexandria and the Stromata is he'll say things like this, but he's also consistently pointing out where Greek philosophy falls short. He's constantly criticizing it while he's pointing out where it was perceiving truth. I mean, the Greeks, you correct me if I'm wrong, but Plato, Aristotle, they all came up with some sort, I know not in equal measure on everything, but, that God, if they didn't flat out say there's one God, they got pretty darn close. The immortality of the soul. Plato is probably clearer on this next part about that there will be a rewards and punishments for how we act in this life, in the next life. I mean, they arrived at all sorts of things that every Christian affirms. And so then,
if I could,
please.
Yeah, I think there's so much there.
Yeah,
and it gets to the heart of why I became a Christian, because
wonderful.
Because what it is to your point, what you're saying, that there is this common consensus among the Greco-Roman philosophical patrimony, that there is this universal source of all things, divine principle behind all things. But then also getting into other issues about this, where you recognize that God is infinite, that he is that, and Plato calls him the form of the good,
Mm.
and that the good is self-communicative.
Mm.
The good communicates itself.
Which is very similar to the first paragraph of the Catechism that talks about
now
God.
This is a principle.
Yeah.
Now this is a principle of theology of that is picked up by the later Platonic tradition. And I think you find it very much articulated well in someone like Philo of Alexandria,
Yeah.
who has his own conception of the Logos, mind you.
Who's a Jew, right? Philo is a Jew, yeah.
Right. He's actually called Philo the Jew, Philo Judaeus. And he elevates this idea of the Logos, that of the divine mind, and also the self-communicative nature of the good of God. You know, God creates all things, and therefore he expresses himself in the creation that he makes. And therefore because he is goodness itself, you say this about the good, that the good communicates itself.
Yeah.
And that is an idea that, if you take it to its logical conclusion, and Philo of Alexandria didn't quite get there. He was very close.
Sure.
But if you take it to its logical conclusion, you have divine infinity, you have the infinite divine goodness, and then you have the self-communicative dimension of the good. You take those three ideas, that God is infinite, that he's infinitely good, and you say also he's infinitely loving because he communicates of himself to others. Then that provides, I think, a really good rational foundation for plausibility, not proof, but plausibility in expecting something like the incarnation.
Yeah.
Because what you have in the incarnation, you don't just have God becoming man. Ask yourself, what is human nature? And this is something that all of the medievalists loved to talk about, which is this idea that human nature is a microcosm of the cosmos. That the human nature has within itself what is found in everything else that exists, right? We have mineral being, we have animal being, sensuous being, and then rational being, spiritual being.
Yeah.
All in one substance, right? And so all of the universe is kind of contained or summarized in man. That's why in Genesis, man is made last, because he summarizes everything that comes before. It's like how in a liturgical procession you have the priest who represents Christ as representing everything in front of him.
Yeah.
So, the great summation of all things.
He comes last.
You have God. He loves the world out of his infinite love, and he wants to communicate himself in the highest way to the highest creature. This is using St. Thomas's reasoning, even though it doesn't come to exactly the same conclusion, but it would stand to reason that it at the very least makes very good, fitting, coherent sense for God to therefore communicate himself in the highest way to the highest creature, the creature that summarizes the whole cosmos that he makes. And that's fulfilled very perfectly in the incarnation.
Yeah.
And then you take that idea and you couple it with the historical witness that's predicated on exactly this idea by people who are not doing abstract philosophy. People, you read John's Greek, and it's not sophisticated Greek. Okay, like John the Apostle was not a philosopher.
Yeah.
And yet he comes to this conclusion. He has this phrase that in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, and the Word became man and dwelt among us. That perfectly brings into a state of refinement and elevation the greatest philosophical contributions that came before.
Yeah.
And he's not even thinking in those terms.
And the term
and
logos was like a philosophically loaded word at the time, correct?
And
Yeah.
and so you have this historical witness through the resurrection and the witness of that, but this whole idea of Christ as the Savior, as the Redeemer, is predicated on this idea that God unites himself with humanity. And by uniting himself with humanity, all things can be reconciled back to himself.
Because humanity
It's a
includes
cosmic
all
scope.
things, per what you were saying
Right.
before.
It's this cosmic scope
Yes.
of the reconciliation of the many to the one. And
Amazing.
that idea was like, wow, you kind of have this symbiotic relationship between the philosophical evidence and the historical evidence working together to create a very compelling rationale for accepting this idea.
It's amazing.
The central claim of Christianity.
I love how you explain that. It did remind me, not to get too sidetracked, it did remind me of, I know the Jews had a similar idea of the temple, that the temple was a sort of representation of the universe. And I would argue that, Paul says that we are the temple now. So I would argue this would be a whole...
take that a step further. And
Sure.
Christ refers that to his body.
Yes.
Body, like he's talking about, he is the temple.
We are little temples who make up the temple, which is Christ's body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Perfectly said. And so it's this cosmic scope of Christianity that I think really coheres with the philosophical tradition. And that's because a lot of people ask, okay, well, how does Jesus, how does revealed religion fit in with everything that you're talking about? That's how.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's how the most foundational premise of Christianity, that God becomes man. And also the Trinity itself. I'm not like Trinity. You can't prove the Trinity from reason, but you can intuit at least.
Yeah.
You can sense at the very least that if you say that God is self-communicative within himself infinitely, then there's got to be some kind of mechanism whereby God communicates himself within himself, considered apart from creatures.
Yeah.
And the Trinity, again, that solves a problem that all of the early philosophers could not solve.
Yeah.
Like the early philosophers, they couldn't solve this mystery about how God can, on one hand, be self-communicative and yet not just necessarily emanate into creation.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the early philosophers held that, and it leads to absurdities, right?
What would be an
Trinity
example of
solves
that? When you say they held that, what would be an example of what they were holding?
Yeah, well, I would say, like, you look at someone like Plotinus, who believes that the world is an emanation from the one. It just flows necessarily from the self-diffusive goodness of the one, right? And the problem there is that ends up making God in some way subject to that which is not God. But if you adopt this Trinitarian understanding that God actually communicates the fullness of his divinity within himself prior to the consideration of creatures through the Son's, through the Father generating the Son in the Holy Spirit, well then that solves that problem for you, right?
That in being itself, there is this self-communicative love.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, which grounds our existence and being as the result of a loving act of creation by God. Because God, because he is to be
right,
is to love in the self-communicative way. I mean, all this is all analogous language, right? It falls completely short to describe adequately the reality of what we're talking about of God, but it gets at it in glimpses. I want to run this. You may think this is stupid, so I'm taking a risk here. But I'm curious what you think, because I love adoration. I need to do it more, but I did it a lot, especially when I first came into the church. My sister loves it. We've had wonderful encounters with our Lord there, and it's astoundingly peaceful. But it was striking me as I was pondering our Lord and the Eucharist, under this rubric of act and potency, that when the bread, in this case we're talking about just the bread because in adoration there is no wine, but when the bread becomes the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord, it is I may be imprecise here, but it becomes, at least in this temporal plane, it becomes the purest, the object with that is most in act that we human beings can interact with. And so when we receive the Eucharist, our Lord describes himself as food, and we know this is related to the manna in the wilderness that helped the Israelites get through the 40 years in the desert. So it's sustaining them. That when we receive the Eucharist, it's a way, to speak philosophically, it's a way that our Lord makes more of us act and less potency, if that makes sense. It's like drawing us into act. We're still obviously, but you know what I mean? Because it's the purest, the object in the purest form of, that's not the right word, the purest act that, on earth is the Eucharist. When we receive it and it becomes our food because it more closely conforms us, who are largely potency, to act. So is any of that remotely interesting or stupid? Well,
no, I think it helps us to, I think that provides a deeper foundation for why we sometimes like to say that in the Eucharist, it's less true that we consume Christ and more true that Christ consumes us.
Yeah.
That we are taken up into his life. We are taken up into his way of being, which is purely actual. It's fully alive. It's more alive than we are.
Yeah.
It has life within itself, right? So we are taken up into that.
It's a life that draws us upward to existence, to being, in a way.
Exactly.
Perhaps I'm speaking more poetically than precisely philosophically, but that's kind of like, if you think of a human being as sort of this, that we would, as one of our priests said at this sermon I mentioned earlier, it's like if God wasn't loving us into existence, we would sort of fall into this void of non-existence. And so since we exist, we're not in that void, but to the extent we're in a state of sin or whatnot, we need to be drawn out of that void and to the source of our existence. And that the Eucharist is one of all the sacraments really, but preeminently the Eucharist is one of the ways in which, we're not only not falling into the void, but we're being, elevated and pulled up into the divine source of our existence.
Right. Exactly. Like, I like to think of it like our reception of the Eucharist is the way in which we latch ourselves onto what the priest will say in the Roman canon, which is he prays that the angel of the Lord will bring this victim up to the throne of the divine majesty.
Yeah.
Right. And so the Eucharist is our way of being caught up into that elevation, and that is in reality an outward manifestation of what is going on within God Himself, which is the love, the infinite love of the Father returned back to the Father by the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Yes. Yep.
Like that is.
It draws us into that self-communicative love
exchange
of
love,
being itself.
Yes, exactly.
This is also
I have a
beautiful.
Bit more time if you wanted to talk about the papacy, but
I think it's too big of a topic to go into the depth we'd want. However, I would like, actually, if you had maybe 10, 15 minutes, and I think we'll talk about this in future discussions as well, but why don't we talk about, it's a huge topic, but just as to cap this off and maybe serve as an introduction for future conversation, internet culture, because you and I think very much agree. And like I said, you're kind of on the, some people would say you're a millennial, some would say Gen Z, it doesn't really matter. But I think you're very respected among a lot of millennials and Gen Z on the internet, as you should be. And as all of this disquisition, to use a good 18th century English word, shows. But yeah, what's your approach to social media, doing evangelism and catechesis to a certain extent on social media? What do you think is a real danger and pitfall that many people are falling into? That seems like a good thing to conclude on, and we can cover the other topics in the future.
Sure. Well, I think there are a number of pitfalls. And most of what I'm going to say is probably, for the most part, unrelated to Gen Z and that whole issue.
Sure.
But actually, I hope you don't mind that.
No, not at all.
But I actually think that some of the pitfalls I'm going to mention are most prevalent
Sure.
among that group sometimes. So one of them, I think, is to see. I had the benefit of my formation happening mostly off of social media.
Yeah, same here.
And I think that,
Yep.
I maintain that's a benefit
100%.
because it's more pure, it's more sincere, it's less self-conscious. It's not caught up in the mess of the public square. It's not, none of it is done performatively.
Yep.
And so I had that benefit of really being drawn into the faith through my own private investigation, my own private study, my own private journey. And that's not me saying that if that doesn't describe you, then you're like cooked. You're like you're done.
Sure.
No, not at all. But what I am saying is that there are certain characteristics of being catechized online, like within the conversation online, that has its drawbacks. Like it really does. And one of those is just you feel like you have to become an apologist the moment you become converted or the
Yep.
moment you become reverted.
Yep.
That's poison. That's a poisonous thought. That's an absolutely poisonous and ruinous thought, I believe.
Yep.
You should be marinating in what you've just learned for at least a few years.
Yep.
I would strongly recommend before you like. Sure, I mean, you could bring it up to your friends and your immediate family and some circle of
Sure.
real circle of friends or whatever. But before you go taking it to the public, before you go taking it online, especially, you really need to spend time by yourself, just marinating, ruminating on these things,
Living it.
living it. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the most important on some level.
Yeah.
Just allowing the seed of the divine word to grow inside of you first and take your time with it. Like really, that's one problem with evangelizing on social media is that everything has to be instantaneous. Right? You have to have your takes right away.
Yep.
You have to follow the current of thought that's happening at a given moment, the current zeitgeist.
The next
That's
thing.
not
Yeah.
right. That is not the space within which the Holy Spirit likes to operate in for conversion. Like it has to be an interior process.
Yep.
And that interior process has to be on its way toward being perfected before you even consider becoming an evangelist online.
Yep.
Like the very thought to me, and this isn't a statement against catechumens, but
Sure.
the very thought to me of a catechumen being an apologist to me is an absurdity.
Oh, totally. Yeah. 100%.
It's like it's an absolute absurdity. Like,
Yep.
I just don't. Maybe there are exceptions to it, but I just think that
Don't think
you
so.
have to be. Yeah, you have to be like you have to be integrated into the mystical body of Christ before you can take on the divine charisms, the divine gifts to share it publicly with, especially online. And I see this mistake made over and over and over again, right? And it's people who they receive the faith, they get prideful about it, and then they become very zealous, and that has its benefits, but they become very zealous and they end up making a fool out of themselves. They say the wrong things. They say things in totally unnuanced ways. They start making moral admonitions that the church doesn't require for people.
Yep.
And it just makes the church look foolish. It makes the church look silly. And it makes your conversion look a little bit shallow.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing I would say. Just avoid that. Secondly, and this I guess pertains. This is closely related to the first thing I said, and this is actually to your point, the point that you made about living it. You have to make sure that you are in a position where you are very familiar, intimately familiar with the church's moral theology
Yeah.
before, because and this can have pitfalls in two directions. In one direction, if you're not properly formed, um, the way you live, um, just because you haven't been properly formed in the church's moral teachings, just about everyday communication and everyday life, you're going to come off as a massive hypocrite for people who are more informed about what the church teaches about morality. So, an
Yeah.
example, like I see this all the time, where young Zoomers, they they get converted, but then like when it talks about or when it comes to like sexuality, um, or like talking about women, and I don't mean this in a sense of I'm not saying they're sexist, but what I'm
Sure.
saying is specifically sexual comments about women. Um, and I don't mean that in the sense of like being non-feminist. I mean in the sense of being sexually impure.
Sure.
Okay, that's a key distinction. This
Sure.
isn't me trying to make a feminist point.
Sure.
This is me trying to say that sometimes they talk about this in a way that is impure, is
Yeah.
sexually impure, is sexually immodest. Like say things like "I would do this, I would do that."
Oh, really?
Even though
Wow.
even though these are sins,
Yeah.
and that is in itself that's just not harmless banter. That is in itself an act of internal impurity.
Yeah.
And when you do that, and I think for the most part, it probably comes from a place of ignorance, which is why you have to form yourself morally first. You have to form yourself in moral theology first before you start to represent yourself as a Christian, to
Yeah.
represent yourself publicly online as a Catholic.
Can I add
that's in one
something to that
direction.
point on the moral
Yeah.
formation? So we have this great rosary campaign every week, and in each of those videos, we announce some new person we're praying for. This week, when we're recording this, we're praying for Joe Rogan. That'd be a pretty cool conversion to see.
Sure.
But I say that there are 4 ingredients to evangelizing and doing apologetics the best we possibly can as Catholics. First is love, love of God above all creatures and love of creatures for the love of God. The second one is arguments, just knowing our stuff as best we can. The third one is prayer, praying for our enemies, praying for those who are trying to convert. And I think people oftentimes skip that. And then fourth, and this is, I wouldn't say maybe it is. I think it's the most forgotten element, but it goes to this moral theology and I think you would totally agree. So I'm not meaning this to contradict you, but to supplement and augment what you're saying. That not just knowing the moral theology of the church, but the fourth ingredient is penance. That we can actually mortify ourselves through fasting, through almsgiving, through various forms of mortifying our will, because that is what ultimately builds the virtue, which virtue, as you well know, is a habit. It's not just an off act, right? And so moral formation is to be formed in habits, like what you are disposing yourself to. And that cannot be done as a Catholic to the degree each of us must do it in order to become saints without penance, without mortification. Right. I mean, when we're recording this, we're in Lent still. And so we are subordinating our lower appetites to our higher, our mind, and which illumined by the Holy Spirit. We're sowing in the Spirit and not our flesh. And we're saying no to even legitimate pleasure. So I would say this moral formation it's absolutely necessary, especially if you're an intellectual. I think way too few people talk about this, penance and mortification. So
that's one direction, though. So these are people who don't properly form themselves in moral theology, and so end up being far too lax.
Sure.
In their public presentation of the church's moral life. But then there's this other direction that I also notice, in the opposite direction. These are people who become Catholic, and then they go all in trying to look for the most
Yep.
trad, the
The
most
rigorous.
ascetical, the most rigorous
Yep.
takes
Yep.
on disputed questions of moral issues. Like, for example, like I saw someone say, like, all premarital hand-holding is a mortal sin,
Oh boy.
or
Gosh.
something like that.
Wow.
Things like that, right? Just going all in on that, and somehow and passing that off to people as if it's the church's teaching, as if it's the
Yeah.
magisterial teachings of the church, as if it's teachings that even most theologians agree with. Like, and then this is another tendency that really should be avoided, because you also make the church look either silly. And what the funny part about this, the ironic part about this, is that if you go all in on that, if you go all in on what's called Tudiorism or rigorism, which is
Yeah.
this idea that you always have to take the more restrictive opinion
Yeah.
on matters of disputed questions in moral theology. We aren't talking about issues where the church has already taught something,
Yep.
or
Yep.
where there's unanimity among the church's moral theologians across time,
Sure.
and not just about opinions, but about matters that they express as belonging to the deposit of faith,
Sure.
right? So we're not talking about that, but we're talking about disputed questions, of which there are many. I mean,
Yeah.
you read these old moral theology manuals, and they'll say, like, well, Alphonsus says this, but like Sporer says that,
Yeah.
right? Like, and you read these moral theology, and they'll say, well, the first opinion, which is held by this reputable theologian and that theologian, this is that, but then the second opinion holds this,
Yeah.
and the church hasn't made either a definitive or even an authoritative judgment on the matter.
Yeah.
So, take this issue. If you take that view that you always got to go with the more restrictive one, then I feel like that is actually a pathway to um, practical laxism, because you set the bar so ridiculously high,
Yep.
that you lose the motivation to even avoid universally agreed upon grave
Yep.
sins, right?
Yeah. The
And so
hopelessness that
there's
comes in because you can never reach it.
exactly, and so
Yeah.
there's a profound danger there. And even if you hold a more rigorous opinion, I firmly believe that if your opinion does not rise to the level of like what a probabilist would demand as far as binding it on other consciences, you should refrain from speaking about it unless
Yeah.
you are an authority. Because if you look at these manuals for confessors, most of these manuals are written for confessors. They will say, like, they are very insistent that the confessor should exercise restraint
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
imposing disputed opinions on penitents.
Yep.
And so even if confessors, so if you are holding yourself to a standard that is less restrained than confessors within the private confessional,
Yeah.
that's a problem.
Yep.
Like, you got to take a step back. So
Is this a sort of Catholic virtue signaling that can take place? You know, it just becomes kind of like the political virtue signaling, but political virtue signaling, I basically see virtue signaling as taking a stance that makes you appear more virtuous than you actually are. And so it's like trying to rely on acts of supposed virtue to make up for a lack of a habitual virtue, which is really what virtue is. So it seems like in some cases they're in the theological sphere, there can be these very hard, rigorous stances because it does make one. There's an odd sense of power that can give us in our fallen human nature.
Right.
Yeah.
Like what it also does is it leads you to think that, oh, most Catholics are deceived.
Yeah.
Even most traditional Catholics are deceived.
Yep.
They don't hold the real trad opinion. They don't hold
Yep.
the real rigorous opinion. Therefore, I'm superior. Therefore, I got to be the one. God has elected me. He's chosen me to save all these people from hell, even though they weren't really in danger of hellfire to begin with.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's appointing yourself as the, and yeah. So I think that's another tendency, and that applies to issues beyond morality too.
Yeah.
But
and again, you're talking about disputed questions, not things the church has settled.
Questions.
Once it's settled, we're all bound to it.
Right. And in that case, like let's say for example, contraception.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other examples we could go to as well, but contraception, the church has definitively ruled on that.
Yeah.
Or even I'm trying to think of another issue, but the idea that you know you this is a good one, like dating without a purpose of finding a spouse. That's a grave sin.
Yeah.
That's putting yourself in a cage, and all moralists agree with that.
Yep.
And no, you're not going to find an encyclical stating that.
Sure.
But all moralists are agreed.
Yeah.
And so in that case, if there's ambiguity about it, yeah, like if you have that understanding, then yeah, you should fraternally correct others about it. And that is an issue that I think a lot of young Catholics tend to fall into. They don't realize. And
Sure.
but again, that's an issue where there's unanimity among moralists.
Yep.
So it's not really disputed. Right?
Which is infallible. In the church has declared that the consensus of theologians is an indicia of infallibility, if that's the right way to phrase it.
Yeah, and it's specifically when they're all in agreement, like expressly about something that pertains to the deposit of faith.
Yeah. Yep. So we have those two
So, like,
things.
for example, like if I wouldn't say, for example, that just because all moralists hold to some very niche opinion about the like at a given age, hold to some niche opinion about the boundaries of usury or something that therefore is infallible. So there are some,
even if all the theologians agree on it.
Like, at that time period.
No, not at the time. Well, yeah. To clarify, all theologians is throughout time. Right. It's not just in one particular epoch. Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually an issue I want to study a bit more. And I don't want to get sidetracked again, but yeah. And then one other element that's been very helpful for me with how I conduct myself online. I mentioned earlier thinking about our Lord's admonition that we have to account for every word. The other one has been, I've read a lot of St. Augustine, and St. Augustine is so clear, as are many fathers. I mean, what's been so interesting is as you read more fathers, there are definitely things that are unique to St. Augustine, but he's actually, you see elements of it in many other fathers as well that are Eastern or Western or whatever. So, but that is ultimately grace that predisposes somebody to conversion and converts them. Obviously their will has to cooperate, but it sort of takes the pressure off of us. Like, our duty is to express the truth as clearly as possible and to refute where necessary, where something's being lied about or misrepresented or whatnot. It is not to convert. Like, ultimately that's God's job, Well, I mean, there's a colloquial sense in which we can refer to convert. We are trying to convert people in the sense that we want them to become Catholic, of course, but we are not the ones that ultimately convert them. That's the work of the Holy Spirit and that person cooperating with the graces that they've received. And so, in a sense, I found that takes the load off of me. Yeah, it allows me to be direct without being mean or rude. I think, at least that's what I shoot for. But it just seems like a lot of people, it's almost like they put too much of a burden on themselves to think that they're the one converting. But when you have a very strong theological formation where you're clear about how uninvolved you are at the end of the day, that is very liberating.
Right. You just have the responsibility to do what you can when the opportunity presents itself.
Yeah.
And God will take care of the rest.
Not to organize providence. Providence is and that's another line from that line from St. Clement of Alexandria that I loved. He was saying that for somebody who believes in providence, they see in Greek philosophy a preparation for receiving the fullness of truth. So for someone who believes that God orders all things for the good of those who love him, as St. Paul explicitly says, then he was able to see philosophy that way. And likewise, in online interactions, I've had so many people reach out to me over the years. I just had a family. They just told me, it came from kind of Protestantism and sort of they were Gentile, but they were like into Messianic Judaism a bit. So they believed Jesus was Messiah and whatnot. But they, Messianic Jews, if people have heard that term. It's honestly, it's kind of like evangelicalism with a Jewish tint to it, I think.
Sure.
But anyway, good people. But they recently decided to come into the church. They're coming in this Easter vigil, and a whole family. They're bringing, a husband and wife and 3 kids.
Oh, wow.
But the wife recently told me, she sent me a nice long message, and she was saying something like, when you were originally posting some of what you were posting, quotes from the church fathers, or, how those quotes, how you were reflecting on those quotes, and, your sense of, the way I speak for myself, I say, I came to the conclusion that I had been deceived by Protestantism or whatnot. So I'm not, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying Protestantism is deceptive or whatnot, but I almost always, describe it as my first person view of my, conversion. Sure. And so she said, I would perceive it as just rude and mean, whatever. She's like, but as I actually started listening and looking into it, I perceived it completely differently. And they're coming into the church. And so, there's only so much we can do. And it's very, very liberating to realize that. God will arrange circumstances to save the elect,
Absolutely.
and that's not up to me. So,
yeah. So it says, like Gergo Lagrange says, God does not demand the impossible.
Yeah.
But he empowers us to do what we can, and he gives us the grace to do what we cannot otherwise do.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's it. That's it.
And so unless you had any concluding thoughts, I think that's a great spot to end. Did you have any concluding thoughts you wanted to offer?
No, just to say that I really appreciate you having me on. I think this was a really great discussion. It really, lately I've just been so busy that I've kind of been a little rusty on some of these things. So this was a great opportunity to kind of rekindle the fire a little bit.
I'm laughing or I'm smirking because none of us realize the rust.
Well, I appreciate that.
No, and we'll have to do more. Like we were originally planning to discuss the papacy, which I think would be really important to discuss. So we'll do that at a later point, time permitting on your end. But I did want to say, and this is not just, I was planning to say it, quite a while ago, so it's not just in response to your kind words, but I really am thankful for the gifts God has given you and the ways you are using them. I think we don't agree on every jot and tittle of everything, but that's not necessary for us to be in loving communion with one another in the church. But I'm just so consistently impressed by your by how you articulate the faith, but also your moral conduct in the public sphere. And so I think it's a wonderful example. And you're one of the few people, in your 20s or 30s, who I think can genuinely be looked to as a model for that. And it's had its own influence on me as well. There's a sort of enlightened detachment that I think all of us would do well to cultivate online. And you do it very, very well. And honored you came on, and I hope we can do this again, soon.
Well, I say the same thing about you, and thank you for all the work that you're doing, and just the amount of erudition that goes into your exposing people to the fathers, right? Just really opening up the treasures, the riches, the gems.
Yeah.
And I just think that's incredible. And so I thank you so much for those kind words, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Absolutely. No, and thank you for that. I'm just sharing what I've received, and sometimes it I call it panning for gold. Like it takes a lot of reading to find those gems. But then when you got those gems, you categorize them, you archive them. That's my nerdy side. We got these quote archives on the site, like the one on the papacy is 60,000 words if people want to. It's just quotes from the fathers about the papacy or somehow related to the papacy. But no, that's beautiful. That's a great spot to end on. And as I told you at the beginning, we normally end with an anthem verse, which has been an anthem verse as it were, for me since college. And it's Psalm 73, verses 25 through 26. Who have I in heaven but you? And on earth I desire nothing besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but the Lord is the strength of my heart and my portion forever.